For most of the 20th century, the story of human intelligence was one of relentless ascent. Decade after decade, in nation after nation, scores on standardized intelligence tests climbed steadily upward. The trend was so consistent and so dramatic that it demanded a name. James Flynn, the New Zealand philosopher and intelligence researcher, gave it one. What became known as the Flynn effect described average IQ gains of approximately 3 points per decade, meaning that a person who scored at the population average in 1930 would, by the standards of 1980, appear to score somewhere in the intellectually disabled range. Flynn was careful about his conclusions. He argued that what IQ tests capture is a form of abstract, formal, hypothetical thinking that modernity rewards and cultivates. The tests were not measuring some fixed essence of mind. They were measuring something real, but also something environmentally contingent, something that could grow and shrink with the conditions of life. That insight, which seemed optimistic when it explained rising scores, would carry a much darker implication when the scores began to fall. Because they did fall. Dutton, van der Linden, and Lin, in a 2016 systematic literature review, documented what they called the negative Flynn effect, a pattern of declining or stagnating scores in multiple developed nations that had previously shown the steepest gains. The reversal was documented in Denmark, Finland, France, the Netherlands, Estonia, Norway, and the United States. In Norway and Denmark, comprehensive military conscription records, a near population-level IKTAU dataset across successive birth cohorts, showed that scores peaked for those born around the late 1970s and began declining for those born afterward. The most methodologically careful investigation came from Bratsberg and Rogerberg in 2018. By examining IQ score differences between brothers within the same family, they controlled for genetic and household-level variables in a way previous studies could not. The trend appeared within families, not just between them. Their conclusion was unambiguous. Both the rise and the fall of IQ scores are environmentally caused. The same kinds of forces that lifted scores, changes in nutrition, in education, in environmental exposures, were capable of reversing those gains when conditions changed. Among the most consequential positive environmental changes of the 20th century was the reduction of lead exposure. For decades, leaded gasoline released vast quantities of lead particulates into the air, soil, and water of entire nations. Children whose developing nervous systems are uniquely vulnerable absorbed this lead through inhalation, contaminated water, and paint in older housing. Research by the CDC and EPA has documented extensively how lead exposure, even at levels previously considered subclinical, is associated with reduced IQ, impaired executive function, and shortened attention span. Rubin and colleagues in a 2017 longitudinal study found that childhood blood lead levels were associated not only with lower IQ in childhood, but with measurable personality differences and elevated rates of mental health conditions across the lifespan. Research on aviation gasoline, which continued to use lead long after automotive fuel was reformulated, further illustrated the relationship, with studies showing that proximity to airports using leaded avgas was associated with systematically lower test scores in nearby children. The phase-out of leaded gasoline is credited as one of the significant contributors to the rising IQ scores of the late 20th century. A parallel story involves iodine. The World Health Organization has long recognized iodine deficiency as the single most preventable cause of intellectual disability worldwide. Iodine is essential for thyroid hormone synthesis, and thyroid hormones are critical for neurological development in fetal life and early childhood. Zimmerman's 2012 review documented that even mild maternal iodine deficiency, without any dramatic visible symptoms, is associated with measurable reductions in cognitive function in offspring. The widespread introduction of iodized salt programs corrected deficiencies that had silently suppressed cognitive potential across generations. As populations achieved adequate iodine status, this nutritional constraint on brain development was lifted and test scores rose. Both stories share a common structure: a specific environmental burden suppressing cognitive potential, followed by an intervention that removed it. They also share a common limitation as explanations for the current reversal. Lead exposure in developed nations has continued to fall. Iodine deficiency has remained corrected. Whatever is now driving the negative Flynn effect must be something new, something characteristic of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The most obvious candidate is the digital revolution. Beginning in the 1990s and accelerating through the 2000s and 2010s, the cognitive environment of people in developed nations underwent a transformation without historical precedent. The nature of attention, what it is directed toward, how long it is held there, how frequently it is interrupted, changed in ways that are only beginning to be understood. Gloria Mark and colleagues at the University of California, Irvine, documented that the average knowledge worker in a digitally saturated environment is interrupted or self-interrupts approximately every few minutes, and that recovering full attentional focus after an interruption takes considerably longer than the interruption itself, often more than 20 minutes. The cumulative effect is a chronic condition of partial attention, the mind perpetually available and responsive but never quite fully present. Wilmer, Sherman, and Cheen, in their 2017 review of smartphones and cognition, found consistent associations between heavy device use and reduced capacity for sustained attention, increased susceptibility to distraction, and greater reliance on external devices for memory. A phenomenon called cognitive offloading, where the effort of remembering is transferred from the biological memory system to the technological one. Smallwood and Schooler's foundational 2006 work on the restless mind further established that spontaneous, undirected thought serves important cognitive functions, memory consolidation, creative insight, but requires something the digital environment increasingly fails to provide: unoccupied time. When every moment of potential boredom is preempted by a device offering stimulation, the mind never gets the opportunity to wander productively. Research published in Frontiers in Cognition in 2023, quantifying attention span across the lifespan, found patterns consistent with the idea that attentional capacity is not fixed. It varies with experience, training, and habit. The tests that show the most dramatic declines in the negative Flynn effect data are precisely those most demanding of sustained attention and working memory. Against this backdrop of human cognitive trends, artificial intelligence has moved in the opposite direction entirely. Comparative AI benchmark studies from 2015 to 2025 document a story of exponential progress across virtually every domain of measured cognitive performance. Systems that in 2015 could barely maintain a coherent conversation were, a decade later, exceeding average human performance on bar examinations, medical licensing tests, graduate-level scientific reasoning tasks, and many of the standardized assessments historically used to measure human intelligence. The scale and speed of this progress exceeded even the most optimistic projections from within the field. The simultaneity of these two trajectories, human cognitive scores declining in precisely the decades when machine cognitive capabilities advance most rapidly, is one of the defining features of the current moment. And yet the relationship between them is not simple. AI systems have become more capable because they have been the subject of deliberate, sustained, extraordinary investment. Human cognitive capacity, by contrast, develops through the accumulated experiences of individual lives shaped by environments constructed for many purposes, most of them having nothing to do with cognitive development. The research of Brotsberg and Rogeberg places the current situation squarely within the domain of human agency. The phase-out of leaded gasoline was a policy choice. The introduction of iodized salt was a public health intervention. The regulation of attention economies, the protection of cognitive environments for children, the design of educational systems that cultivate sustained reasoning rather than surface responsiveness. These too are choices, or at minimum domains in which choices are being made by default through inaction as much as through action. The negative Flynn effect, understood this way, is not a counsel of despair. It is a diagnosis, and diagnoses are the necessary first step toward treatment. Human cognitive capacity has risen before when conditions supported it. The same environmental responsiveness that allowed those gains can allow them again if the conditions that support deep thinking are deliberately cultivated rather than casually undermined. That is the most important message in this body of research. Not the alarm of declining scores, but the responsibility that environmental causation places on all of us.